Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for including me in this very interesting event. Happy to join with you all. So I can give you a very short answer to that question before I dive deeper into talking a bit about proportionality and all of its complexities. But so the short answer is yes. But since I have 12 minutes, we'll dive into that a little bit more. Every state has, just like every human being, has a right of self-defense. If we think about a system in which there was no right to defend yourself, the idea of being bound by that law would unfortunately go by the wayside, because everybody would decide, every person, every state would decide that the law was not sufficient to address basic needs. But let me address that more through the lens of this question of proportionality. So we tend to see the word proportionality just used for almost anything anybody wants to say about conflict, and particularly as a buzzword for any issue, any critique, any discussion of Israel's conflicts with Hamas in particular. So what does it mean when we say that, you know, Israel's operation was proportionate, or what we normally see was disproportionate? So before diving into the legal discussion, if I were to diagnose what the sort of ordinary person on the street means when they say something is proportionate or disproportionate in terms of a military operation, what they basically mean is it was about the right amount, not too much force. It seemed to be about right. Well, that's a gut reaction. That's not a standard by which we can measure or assess or plan military operations. It certainly would not give a leader, a military commander, or anybody else who was deciding in advance what is it that we can accomplish here. It doesn't provide any kind of standard. So luckily, the law actually gives us a lot of guidance on what it means when we talk about proportionality. And I think one sort of other preliminary point that's important to note here is that war is just awful, right? War is awful in no matter what situation. It doesn't matter whether it's justified. It doesn't matter whether there's a dispute about who was right in using force. The fact of war is a tragedy in every situation, right? So we're already starting, when we talk about any kind of conflict, we're in a heightened state of concern, of loss, of violence, of tragedy, which makes any conversation a bit more fraught. And so that's important to realize. But the idea of assessing the legality, and I want to come back to Andrew's word of legitimacy, which is very important. The idea of thinking about that based on a gut reaction of, well, I don't really think they needed to go that far, that's just kind of absurd. So let's talk about proportionality in two ways. The first one is in thinking about what a state can do to protect itself when it's being attacked. So in this case, Israel is being attacked, some over 4,000 rockets. I don't think it's hard to determine that rockets landing on your territory are an attack. I think by any measure, rockets exploding on your territory, causing damage, harming people, killing people, destroying things is an attack. That's pretty easy. And so the predicate for being able to respond in self-defense exists, right? But what the law says, right, what international law says is if you're going to act in self-defense, you have to meet two basic conditions. The first one is it has to be necessary, right? There has to be a necessity to act. That's good because we want to minimize the resort to war generally in the international system. It's safer for everybody that way. So you need a necessity. Well, when you have a terrorist group that is attacking you and there's no, possibility of negotiating, etc., there's a necessity to take out those rocket launchers, to take out their command structure, to make those attacks stop. The second condition is this question of proportionality. And proportionality, when you're acting in self-defense, is about the extent, how much force you can use to make those attacks go away. It's not a tit for tat. It's not a symmetry. It's about, I want to make these attacks end, so I can use the amount of force that will make that happen. When we look at the recent conflict, right, as long as Hamas's attacks are continuing into Israel, it's pretty hard to say that continuing to respond to end those attacks is disproportionate, right? You still have a need. You obviously haven't yet completed that goal. One other question that comes up here is that sometimes we see arguments that because of Iron Dome, Israel doesn't need to respond with military force to take out rocket launchers and other Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other groups, their capabilities in Gaza. In short, I think this is somewhat of a bizarre argument, right? To say, oh, you've come up with a good defense, so you just sit here and, just be a punching bag and just try to deflect everything. When we consider the fact that Israelis have to spend days and weeks in bomb shelters and everything shuts down and people are still being killed and there's still destruction and enormous amounts of disruption, that argument just doesn't hold water. I find it absurd, actually. So let's, I'm keeping an eye on time here. So in terms of self-defense, what's interesting here is that Israel's position, Israel's situation is a very clear example of why we have law allowing states to act in self-defense. You're being attacked, right? The only way to stop it is to actually destroy, degrade, disable, neutralize that capability of that adversary, and you respond in a way to do so. So why is it such an issue, right? Because obviously there's a huge debate about this. There's an enormous amount of criticism saying that Israel is not acting proportionately. Well, now we need to weave in another concept of proportionality, because what's happening in all of these conversations is that the conversation about whether Israel's overall actions are proportionate in self-defense is being driven by, infected by, complicated by another concept of proportionality. And this is the concept of proportionality in the law of war, in the law that governs how you fight. Not if you can fight, that's the question of self-defense, but how. When you're actually in a conflict, how must you conduct yourself? And here the law sets out comprehensive methodologies, principles, and rules for how parties to a conflict can conduct themselves, can conduct hostilities with an eye to accomplishing two things, right? The protecting civilians, upholding the humanitarian imperative of mitigating and minimizing suffering during war, but also recognizing and enabling the pursuit of the military objective. Those two things happen at the same time in war. Proportionality in the law of war is about minimizing harm to civilians from lawful military operations. So the question is, if there is an attack on a lawful military objective, and I'm guessing we'll get some questions about that as well. So if Israel is attacking Hamas targets, Hamas militants, Hamas capabilities, rockets, etc., it also needs to take account of any incidental harm to civilians. That's what proportionality is about. What the rule says is that when you're attacking a lawful target, if the expected harm to civilians will be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage gained, then you can't launch the attack. So what is that all about? That's about when you are planning or launching an attack, you have to assess what's the value of the target? Why am I attacking it, right? What's the gain going to be? Including, well, they won't be able to use that rocket launcher to shoot at us anymore. That's a pretty significant military advantage, right? And what do I expect to be the harm to civilians in the area? And then you have to look at them. Now, proportionality is not, is my attack likely to cause harm to civilians? Is my attack likely to cause a lot of civilian casualties? Is it going to cause civilian harm that's a little bit greater than the military advantage I'm going to get? Proportionality is actually a rule of excessiveness, right? The word proportionality is actually just not really appropriately descriptive. So it's a methodology. Assess the probable harm to civilians, the expected harm to civilians, assess what you're going to get as a military gain, and then consider whether the harm to civilians is going to be excessive. So how does this get manipulated in this conflict and past conflicts? Well, now we come back to the question of legitimacy. And legitimacy in most contemporary military operations is about the perception of compliance with international law. Not the actual compliance, but the perception of compliance with the law of war. And herein lies the challenge. Because what that means is that ultimately the conflict in the international space, in the international court of public opinion, is an information war. Okay, so Israel is fighting a kinetic war to stop attacks on its territory and its population.
Laurie, that you have 2 minutes to conclude.
Okay, and Hamas is fighting an information war in order to demonstrate and the delegitimization of Israel's operations, in order to chip away and damage the legitimacy of Israel's operations. So what happens? Well, we see the unfortunate and tragic use of the civilian population in Gaza for this purpose. We see the deliberate placing of military objectives in and among the civilian population. Why? Well, either to protect it from attack, because based on the methodology of the law of war, right, an attacking party must take into account possible harm to civilians, or to actually cause that harm to civilians. Because once that harm to civilians is caused, the world only sees the casualties, it sees the destruction. It doesn't see the analysis that took place in advance. It doesn't see the information about what was the military advantage. It sees the highly mediagenic, the highly tragic destruction and death. That then creates the assumption, the perception of a war crime, right? Of a violation of the law. Now, Hamas has all the ingredients it needs to engage in that information war on legitimacy.
Thank you, Laurie.
So let me tie this all together in my last few seconds.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I said that the analysis of Israel's, whether it's acting proportionally in self-defense, ends up incorrectly being driven by this whole information discourse about the proportionality of its attacks. And what happens is that we begin to see, we see sort of extensive discussion of, well, this many people died on this side of the conflict and many, many more people died on that side of the conflict, so it must be something wrong. This is the only conflict in which we see a comparison of casualties as the measure of legality. There's nothing in the law that says there's supposed to be an equal number of casualties on both sides of a conflict. And conflicts are fought in one territory, but maybe not the other. So I think I'm out of time. I know we'll have time for questions, but to sum up, we have a lack of understanding of how the law works, a perversion of how the law works, an exploitation of that. And unfortunately, as I said, because this is really an information war, it proves very difficult to combat.
Thank you very much, Laurie. It was very interesting.
Thank you,
Sarah, do
Laurie.
we have some very precise questions for Laurie just after her intervention?
I have one question, which also has come up earlier, Aryeh, for you, Laurie. That is, clearly, Israel is not just fighting against Hamas. Hamas is allied with Iran. You know, it's now well known Iran has been providing weapons directly. It's been financing Hamas. This has been prepared for a long time. And it's not only Hamas, and there's also the question of Hamas's fight with Fatah within the PLO. In assessing the threat, to what extent is that international context something that should be looked at? Because surely, you know, part of the thing is Israel realizes that whatever happens next, Iran is going to keep being weaponized and supported and resourced. So it's part of Israel's fight regionally against threats against them. Is that relevant?
I think it's certainly relevant, right? How it's relevant, I think depends on the particular analysis that is taking place. And so there was a fair amount of discussion in the news about this operation, about you know, what was Israel trying to achieve on this particular round. And it was trying, most of the accounts would describe an effort to sufficiently degrade Hamas's capabilities so that it would set Hamas back X number of years, which would produce ideally some similar X number of years of quiet, right? Now, if in fact that open source information is correct, of course I have no ability, you know, I'm just working with what we read in the news, but if that's the lens through which we're thinking about this, then Iran's involvement, Iran's commitment, capability, access, etc., to rebuild, to enhance Hamas's capabilities, restock, etc., certainly is relevant in that analysis of what is, again, necessary and proportionate to repel or deter. Those are the words from international law: repel or deter this attack that Israel is responding to in self-defense, right? Understanding what you need to do, how the extent of force that is both necessary and appropriate to satisfactorily defend yourself, depends on understanding the source of that attack, the extent of the attacker's capability, motive, intent, etc. So it's relevant, right? It's often useful when thinking about these conflicts to remember that international law exists outside of the Israel-Hamas conflict, right? Because, and if we take the names out, we can sometimes think more, we can have a more rational discussion about international law. You know, if you imagine a country that is being attacked by what appears to be a small actor, then if in isolation, you might say, oh, well, you only need a kind of a small punch back to take care of that threat. But let's say that information is not correct and that small actor is a proxy for a big, angry, scary, you know, powerful actor. Now you might need a bigger punch, right? I mean, that's essentially how international, like how in a quick sense to think about your question. There's lots of other pieces of how Iran might be relevant. Is it a party to the conflict? Is it, you know, and so on and so forth. But as a matter of self-defense, it is relevant in understanding what is considered necessary and proportionate